welcome to today's presentation on social media monitoring for emergency managers. We're a group of master's students studying public administration, and this is our final presentation project. My name is Janelle Wallace, and I have a bachelor's in business administration from the California State University, Chico. Prior to coming to Syracuse, I spent 2 years living in Sydney, Australia, where I worked for a nonprofit organization. In this role, I helped manage social media accounts and also promoted volunteer opportunities for different emergency management groups.
Hi, I'm Amanda Vitullo. I graduated from Ithaca College in 2012, and prior to coming to Maxwell, I served at the City of Albany's Economic Development Branch, where I ran all of their social media and dealt with media on a day-to-day basis. After graduating from Maxwell, I will be serving as an Excelsior Service Fellow in Governor Cuomo's Executive Chamber.
My name is Elise Alley, and I graduated from the University of Michigan in 2012. Afterwards, I completed a service program called Teach for America for 2 years, where I taught 5th grade on the Navajo Reservation. And after the Maxwell School, I will be a strategy and operations consultant at Deloitte in Washington, D.C.
Hi, I'm Mariko Mori. Before coming to Maxwell, I was working for Japanese government. During 2011 nuclear disaster in Fukushima, I was helping to revise the Labor Standard Act to protect the front workers. After 1 more year study in the US, I will be back to Japan.
We would just like to take a brief moment to acknowledge all the support that we've gotten from our faculty advisor, Dr. Merkel, from our sponsor, the Central New York Region of Emergency Management, and from the different emergency management experts that participated in our research. We cannot express enough gratitude for the opportunity to work on this project, and we've been very excited to dive in deeper into all the different material. To conduct our research, we interviewed nearly 20 people across the country. The names and locations of the different people that we interviewed have been provided on the slide above. Further details will be outlined in our final report, in case you're interested to get in contact with the experts directly. Our final report, as Dr. Marvel mentioned, will be available online, and we plan to have it completed by this Friday. For our final project, we worked with the Central New York Region of Emergency Management to understand social media monitoring on both a technical and non-technical level. We looked at how emergency management organizations can implement low-budget strategies when they are not able to hire consultants or use other more expensive tools. During our interviews, experts provided us hands-on examples about how they are using social media for emergency situations. We recognize that this is a new and emerging field, so we tried to focus on areas that were more experienced and already implementing good practices. As part of this process, we looked at virtual operations support teams, also known as VOS. These organizations provided a good framework to see how emergency groups analyze, gather, and communicate information during an emergency. Social media is fundamentally changing how citizens are talking about emergency situations. Through our interviews, we learned about how they are managing resources, how they're managing concerns about reliability, and which tools have been the most helpful when they're looking to get started. The experts we interviewed use social media to communicate about a wide variety of different topics, including community health, infrastructure damage, social unrest, and natural disasters. For example, social media teams were activated in Los Angeles for wildfires, in New York when the East Village building collapsed, in Hawaii during tropical storms, in Ohio to promote Amber Alerts, and in Oregon to share health information about Ebola. Throughout these different examples, social media has been used to monitor information, to dispel rumors, and amplify the truth. To begin, we're going to talk about how to set up social media within your respective organizations. The first step is for your social media team to establish their mission, vision, and values. Some main points to consider are on what types of emergencies will you activate your monitoring team. Does the monitoring team activation depend on the type of emergency or on the geographic location? Next, does the monitoring team activation depend on the severity of the disaster? And lastly, does the social media monitoring team activation depend on the quantity of information that is out there on social media? According to social media monitors in Colorado, it is important to set the scope and the mission of your social media monitoring operations. In addition, they also recommended to decide ahead of time the reasons and conditions under which your team will undergo an activation. Next, we're going to talk about constructing your team. Do you want your team to be made up of paid volunteers? Do you want your team to be made up of volunteers, paid staff, or both? Your team can be made up of strictly volunteers, or you may already have people existing within your organization that are social media savvy. Some of the experts we talked to recruited virtual team members from their administrative assistant pool, or they also worked with other emergency organizations in different counties or from different agencies. It's important to note that all team members receive proper training before their team was activated on an official emergency. Next, I'm going to hand it off to Elise.
All right, thank you so much. So I'm going to first talk a little bit about setting a structure and choosing a leader. So with all of the information that we collected, all of the people we talked to, they actually use this structure when they are monitoring social media. So they always have either an emergency manager or public information officer that's located within their EOC during the emergency. They have a team leader who not only monitors social media, but is also overseeing all of the team members. And they're the ones that are responsible for taking the information that's collected on social media and deciding what information is then moved to the emergency manager. So one example that we were given is with the East Village building collapse. So they had already chosen an emergency manager to communicate with the team leader. And at first, the emergency manager asked the team leader to find pictures of the structural damage. And so the team leader then went back to all of the team members and started collecting all of this information. And partway through the disaster, the emergency manager realized that they were actually getting too much information. So then they re-clarified with the team leader that actually they only want pictures of the most severe damage so that they can then choose to deploy their resources to only the most affected areas, through which the team leader then told all of their monitors to only find the worst damage to then move to the emergency manager. Now, when you find a team leader, you're going to want somebody who's proficient in all of the social media platforms that they are monitoring so that they can oversee the team members and kind of have a really good understanding of how the actual platforms work. So this team leader can be either internal or external to your organization. So you might want to find somebody who is not actually in the EOC who can devote all of their time to managing the volunteers, or you can actually find somebody that's external to your organization. For example, many of the emergency managers that we spoke to actually as professional courtesy will help other emergency managers that are outside of their region during an emergency in order to kind of help ease some of the pressure off of the emergency manager. Sometimes you'll want to have multiple team leaders that will rotate through different shifts in order to make sure that you always have a team leader that's present. Obviously, people need to go to sleep, so it's helpful to have somebody else who will step in and help monitor through the night. Your team members will kind of depend on, or the number of team members will depend on the severity of the emergency and also the number of social media platforms that you want to monitor. A best practice that we heard oftentimes is that you want to have at least one person per platform, so you don't want to have somebody who's monitoring multiple platforms at one time. One example that we were also given as a best practice is to create a handbook ahead of time. The example that you see right here is actually from Colorado, and this is posted online and it's public. Everything's in writing, so everything is decided ahead of time. They have their mission, vision, and values located on this handbook. They have their membership expectations, activation, deactivation, and platform completely outlined. So this is an example that you can go to later when you're developing your social media monitoring plan. And this is actually considered a really great practice because With staff turnover, you'd want to help build institutional memory so that if a new emergency manager comes in, then they are able to take this information and continue to monitor during an emergency. Another thing that we spoke to a lot with our interviews was about volunteers. So most of the emergency managers that we spoke to actually don't have the internal capacity during an emergency to monitor social media 24 hours a day. So a lot of them actually go to outside volunteers in order to help them. So the example that you're seeing right here is from Oregon. A big problem out west is the wildfire season. So they often have multiple wildfires going over multiple days. So they actually have to work really hard to recruit volunteers throughout the year. As you can see, they tweeted to ask for volunteers to help them, and they are pretty successful in gaining volunteers this way. One thing that you want to make sure that you do that was actually outlined in Colorado is think about the qualifications and the membership expectations so that volunteers kind of know what the time commitment will be for them. Generally, you also are looking for people that are proficient in at least Twitter and Facebook. And if they're also proficient in Hootsuite or TweetDeck, that's also really a big plus, but they can also be trained in those things as well. Some of the pools that a lot of people pulled from are existing and retired staff. And they also actually told us that a lot of them go to colleges for college students that will help as well. And some of them even go internationally. And recruiting from college students internationally actually help because students obviously don't necessarily have a job, so they can monitor through the night. And also people in different time zones can really help make sure that you don't have any gaps in your coverage. So the example that you're seeing is a best practice with regards to selecting your volunteers. This is also from Colorado. They actually have an application. They run a background check on any external volunteers that they have. You're seeing an example of kind of what they have the volunteers fill out. They have all of their contact information, and they also ask for all of their social media accounts, because before you select a volunteer, you can actually kind of see their Twitter and Facebook profile and see kind of how active they are and how proficient they seem on these platforms. And again, they also make sure to communicate when they're selecting the volunteers what the expectations are with regards to training. From the people that we spoke to, they tend to run about one training per month that lasts about 1 to 2 hours, and possibly sometimes they have a homework assignment. And a lot of the emergency managers from across the country will actually coordinate with one another to have a virtual training that volunteers can go to, so that it's not all kind of burdened on one emergency management organization to always host these trainings. One thing that was reiterated to us over and over again are kind of the characteristics and skills that you really want to have in your volunteers. You want people who are curious and interested, very attentive to details, have the ability to multitask and work across different platforms. Another thing that we were warned about is that you want to look for external volunteers who aren't kind of self-promotion seeking. They have had some issues with volunteers who might abuse the social media monitoring accounts, who might post information to the public that the public information officer doesn't want going out, and those volunteers are asked to step off of the activation and are not asked back. Many of the emergency managers actually talk to each other about certain volunteers. Some of the volunteers actually build kind of a reputation for having a lot of integrity. So if they're kind of short on a certain activation, then they might go to another emergency manager and ask for a recommendation for a volunteer to help out. Another big issue when you have external volunteers is retention. This was reiterated to us over and over again. The reason why this is sometimes a problem is that people will recruit a volunteer that will work on only one activation and then not come back again. And so they kind of gave us some really nice best practices to help out with that. We were told that people should actively engage with their volunteers, try to build a personal and professional relationship with them. Another thing that we were forewarned about is making sure to align the volunteer skills and interests with the designated tasks. We were told in California when they were monitoring the protests with regards to Ferguson that some of the volunteers ethically felt like it was wrong for the government to be monitoring that on social media. And therefore, in order to prevent kind of alienating some of their volunteers, they allowed those volunteers to sit out and instead had other people who were asked to step in instead. A lot of these groups also utilize their teams even when there's not an emergency. They run trainings. They have some team bonding exercises as well. And they also offer to assist with other emergencies around the country. As you can see as an example, the Colorado social media monitoring team is actually thanking an emergency manager from New Mexico. They're showing their appreciation to this volunteer to make the volunteer feel that they're appreciated and to make them want to come back and help volunteer again. Another thing that was obviously reiterated to us over and over again is the importance of trainings. This is used to help keep their monitoring skills sharp. A lot of times they bond with each other, both on a personal and professional level during these trainings. They can either be in person or they can be virtual, depending on the type of training that you want to host. A lot of the emergency managers actually told us that they would be more than happy to run trainings for Central New York for the staff that are physically present or for volunteers that are interested in joining. It also helps to reinforce the processes and expectations for the volunteers. As you can see, the Ohio social media management team will publicly post when they're having trainings to not only kind of recruit volunteers, but will also show that they're an active social media monitoring team. Another thing that was spoken to us often about the training is the difference between an open and a closed simulation. Open simulations are open to the public and they're strictly for practice. One of the things that we were warned about with open simulations is that it can scare the public. Sometimes people don't necessarily realize that it's a simulation and they think it's an actual emergency, and then they'll start tweeting and sharing on Facebook. This is an example from the Clark Regional Emergency Management Organization when they had a 3-day simulation that was open, the public could see it. They reiterated that it was only an exercise. They started a blog to let the community know that it was only an exercise and they didn't need to panic. One thing that you could do as well is a closed simulation. Those are actually created by consultants and they're not open to the public, but they have the feel of an actual simulation. This is often cost prohibitive for most emergency management organizations. The number that was thrown around to us a lot was $10,000, which obviously most emergency management organizations don't have, but it is available out there. But we didn't talk to anybody who had actually been able to use one. All right. And now I'm going to pass it off to my colleague Amanda, and she's going to talk about stage 2, which is activation of the actual monitoring team.
Okay, so the first part of phase 2 is getting your social media team up and going. And the most important thing you need to know before you do any of this is what the lead organization's intent are before activating your team. You should understand the goals of activation, what the lead organization wants done, and how the deliverables will be completed. In short, you should clarify the purpose of the activation. Above, you'll see a detailed list of what activation looks like for the Colorado team. And as you can see, they clearly outline what each of the steps are and what are the necessary tools needed for each of those steps. So once those parameters are set, you can begin sharing with your activation team. But first you should set communication expectations. Make sure that you have a set method for how you're going to be communicating with your team that it's time for activation. This can be done through email, via telephone, or through social media. And you'll see from the example above, they let their team members know via Twitter. One thing that's very important to be cognizant of is that you want your team members to know that they should respond to you either if they are responding or if they're not. Once you have all of your team members on board, you can then start the human resource management end of things. This is an example from the Pacific Northwest social media team. And here, the team member's name goes in, what their availability is on what dates, and it's a great way to kind of see what your coverage is like. You're going to want to manage, it's suggested that you manage throughout the day and the night, typically in 3 to 4 hour shifts. And so using this document, you can identify the gaps and then fill in where necessary and organize amongst yourself. Okay, so now on to the most important part of social media monitoring, the actual monitoring. But before you can begin monitoring, you need to organize amongst your volunteers. This is an example of an activity log, and what this does is it outlines what each of the team members is going to be doing. Typically, this is organized by the team leader, and you're going to record who is doing the action, and the action is what they're monitoring, the time that they'll be doing it, the date, and then if there is any issue that occurs while the individual is doing that action, it can be flagged and then followed up for a potential resolution. The team leader really wants to make sure that they play to the strengths of each of the team members. So if somebody's really strong on Twitter, if they're interested in Twitter, have them monitor Twitter. If somebody is really interested in Facebook or very strong in Facebook, have them monitor Facebook. Okay, so now into the actual monitoring. I'm going to cover some different monitoring methods for Facebook and Twitter. There are also a number of different tools that you can use, and we'll touch upon some of those briefly in our report. So for Facebook, we're using the example of the prison break. It's all, you're all very aware of it. When you're monitoring Facebook, it's recommended that you search community spaces. So you're going to want to look at those community pages like news media outlets. Some of your local municipalities may have Facebook pages. You're going to want to look where your community kind of convenes and meets together. Sometimes there are Facebook groups that your community may have. Those are oftentimes private, but if they're open, look at them. And you're specifically looking at the public comments. From this example, this is from the Press Republican, which is a newspaper from the North Country. They posted the article about the escaped prison inmates. And you can see Kristen up there she found them. They're in the woods off of the road. So that's something that's going to want to go in your shared information document, which I'll touch upon in a minute. So Twitter. Twitter's a great tool for monitoring, and it's a best case scenario if you're able to establish with your community what tags they should be using for what situation. That way you kind of already know what you're looking for. You don't have to do a lot of searching as to what the tag is for the moment. But oftentimes with emerging situations, there are tags that are going to be used that you did not set. So you're going to want to look on Twitter, see kind of what those themes are, and you're likely going to run into multiple tags. For the Dannemora situation, we've seen tags like hashtag Dannemora, hashtag prison break New York. You're going to have a long list of these tags. A great tool to use when you want to monitor multiple tags is a tool called Twitterful. And what it does is it allows you to search multiple tags. As you can see up here, we were looking at tweets that had the word Willsboro, then hashtag Clinton Correction, hashtag Dannemora. What it does is it'll drop the tweets down on the website in chronological order. And then a really nice feature of this tool is that you can actually use geotagging. So oftentimes when somebody sends out a tweet, it will have their location kind of pinned to it. And so we specifically went into the feature on this tool. We looked for tweets that were coming from within a 30-mile radius of Willsboro, New York, because that was where all the action was happening yesterday. So once you have found all of this excellent information, you're going to want to share it on a shared document. This is supposed to serve as a catch-all. So you put everything that you found on this document. This is an example from the Pacific Northwest, and as you can see, there's a date of when they found the information, a time of when that information was shared, who the team member was that found it, a summary of the information, URL so you can follow up and see it, and then actions requested. So I will touch on in the next slide is some things may need to be vetted. Other things may need to go straight to the emergency manager. So this is where your team members can communicate, what should be done with this information. So naturally, with all of this information, a lot of it needs to be vetted. A good process to set is to look for trusted accounts and to have a collaborative document that has a list of all of the accounts that you trust. And these can be emergency management organizations, they can be local government, law enforcement, or local media outlets. That's just a quick way to kind of identify that this is a reliable source. Oftentimes, though, you're going to be running into information that's not from these trusted actors. And so you're going to want to check and see if the information was repeated from at least 2 or 3 independent sources. And if that's not the scenario, you can look at the user's profile, see the stuff that they're typically tweeting. If there was an emergency in your community 5 months before and they were tweeting the wrong information repeatedly that time, you might want to flag it as something that, okay, this needs to be followed up with. Also, a great tool to use if the information that you're looking to vet has a photo involved is to do a reverse Google image search. And what this does is you take the image that's from the tweet or the Facebook post, drop it into here, and Google will search all of the websites that it has in its index to see if the image shows up on any other websites. You can then follow up with that website, see if it pertains to that disaster or if it's something that's from something completely different. You can also check the properties of your photo. Oftentimes, photos have indexed within them is the date for which they were taken. And so if you left click it, I think it's somewhere in the view properties. And then you can identify, is this photo related to the actual emergency? Did somebody manipulate it to make it seem as though it was, or is this just something from a completely different event? So after you vet, you're naturally going to run into misinformation. So you're going to want to monitor for rumors, for new rumors. An example of a new rumor yesterday was that somebody in Willsboro unfortunately said that they had caught the bad guys, which I'm sure we all would have believed. As you can see, wasn't quite the case. So you're going to want to look for those reoccurring trends. When you identify those reoccurring trends, you're going to want to amplify the proper message, which I will expand upon a little bit further in a minute. But also with ongoing rumors, they can self-correct. As you can see, this reporter, she said that there was people reporting that they were captured, and she is clarifying, nope, New York State Police says that's not true. So if you do have a rumor that persists, you're going to want to amplify the message. Leverage a mix of social media platforms, reach as many people as you possibly can. It's very, very important that you have the truth outlive the rumor, because that's the best way that you're going to shut it down. As you can see, this tweet from the Ohio boss, they sent out a very professional tweet. Ebola was obviously something that sent people into a little bit of a panic this fall, and so they had this message that got sent out to tell people this is where you can find the information. This also helps build credibility with your audience over time, which is something that's very, very important. Okay, and with that, I'm going to move to Mariko, who's going to talk about stage 3.
So now I talk about 4 important points during stage 3, that's after emergency. So first, deactivate the social media monitoring team. The social media team leader can work closely with emergency managers and the public information officer to determine when the team can deactivate and return to normal operations. When we spoke to Colorado experts, they emphasized the importance of knowing who has the authority to deactivate the team. Before deactivation, they want to be sure to correct important documentations and ensure that all information are properly archived. After the deactivation has been authorized, all team members should be notified, like the example here. Social media accounts are also used to direct people to active informational sources during this transition. Next, debrief and reflection. Once the team are deactivated, the people we interviewed recommended debriefing the team, summarizing actions, and evaluating the team's performance. Groups in the US and also UK also documented the summary of action by using formal reporting and archiving methods. They found that a written record was helpful to build institutional memory. At the same time, they continue to monitor and capture information on the public sentiment about how the situation was handled. This helped their team reflect on what went well, what didn't go well, and how the team can improve in the future. Next, ensure emotional needs. We learned that teams need to ensure their emotional needs are met. Monitoring social media during a disaster can be a traumatic experience for volunteers and also for staff due to the graphic nature of social media content. Depending on the nature of the emergency, it may be beneficial to have professional trauma counselors to assist with emotional needs in person or virtual Skype chat room. Lastly, continue social media efforts. Even when the emergency is not going on, the social media manager is encouraged to monitor for certain hashtags always. The monitoring team can use this space as an opportunity to build good relationships and gain more credibility. They can also support long-term recovery and amplify the needs of those who are suffered by the disaster. The team is expected to continue participating in trainings. It's important to strive for continuous improvement and adapt to new technology. Make sure to learn from the past monitoring experiences and emphasizing training opportunities. In our final report, we will provide a list of different training opportunities and resources. This concludes our presentation, and we are happy to take your questions.